The arrow missed Sarah's heart by inches, embedding itself in the wooden post where she'd been standing just moments before. In the dust and chaos of the Apache raid, she thought she was going to die on this god-forsaken frontier, far from everything she'd ever known. Then he appeared, a warrior whose presence commanded both fear and respect among his own people. He could have let her perish with the rest of the settlement, but instead he chose to save her life. Now, 3 months later, he's come to collect what she owes him. The debt isn't gold or cattle or land. It's something far more precious and impossible to give. He wants her younger sister, Emma, innocent, trusting Emma, who doesn't understand the brutal mathematics of survival on the frontier. But what happens when the price of one sister's life becomes another sister's freedom? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The flames had consumed everything Sarah held dear that terrible August morning 3 months ago. She could still smell the acrid smoke when the wind shifted just right, could still hear the screams of her neighbors echoing across the valley. The Brennan homestead had stood for 12 years against drought, locusts, and bitter winters, but it took less than an hour for the Apache raiders to reduce it all to ash and memory. Sarah clutched the charred family Bible she'd pulled from the ruins, its leather cover cracked and pages singed brown at the edges. Her father had carried this book from Pennsylvania when they first ventured west, believing that God's word would protect them in the wilderness. Now the Holy Scriptures bore witness to a different kind of salvation, one that came with a price she was only beginning to understand. She remembered every detail of that morning with the clarity that trauma burns into memory. Emma had been hanging laundry behind the house, humming one of their mother's old hymns, when the war cries first echoed across the prairie. Sarah had been kneading dough for the morning bread, her hands white with flour, when she heard the thunder of unshod hooves approaching from the west. The attack came with the suddenness of a summer storm. One moment she was watching Emma pin their father's work shirts to the line, and the next, warriors on painted horses were streaming through their yard like a flood of fury and vengeance. Sarah's first instinct had been to run to Emma, to shield her younger sister from whatever was coming, but a burning timber from the barn crashed down between them, separating the sisters by yards that might as well have been miles. In the chaos, Sarah had found herself trapped against the side of the house, flames licking at her skirts, smoke burning her lungs. She'd pressed herself against the rough wooden siding and closed her eyes, whispering the Lord's Prayer, the way her mother had taught her, preparing to meet whatever judgment awaited her. That's when she'd felt a strong hand close around her wrist. When she opened her eyes, she was looking into the face of an Apache warrior, unlike any she'd ever imagined. He wasn't the savage demon the frontier newspapers described, but a man perhaps 30 years old, with intelligent dark eyes and a bearing that spoke of natural authority. War paint marked his cheeks in red and black stripes, and eagle feathers adorned his long black hair. But it was his expression that caught her, not the bloodthirsty rage she expected, but something closer to assessment, as if he were measuring her worth in some calculation she couldn't comprehend. He spoke to her in English, his voice calm despite the violence raging around them. "You want to live?" The question seemed absurd in the midst of the destruction, but Sarah found herself nodding, some primitive survival instinct overriding her shock. "Then you owe me?" he said simply, and pulled her away from the burning building. She never saw exactly what happened to the other raiders, but somehow the attack ended as suddenly as it had begun. When the smoke cleared and the thunder of hooves faded into the distance, Sarah found herself standing in the ruins of her family's life, with Emma sobbing in her arms and a mysterious warrior nowhere to be seen. The other survivors, the Hendersons from the next homestead over, old Pete, who ran the trading post, Martha Kelly, who'd lost her husband but saved her 3 young children. They all spoke of the attack as if it were just another Indian raid, brutal, but not uncommon on the frontier. None of them seemed to have noticed the warrior who'd saved Sarah's life, or if they had, they didn't mention it. In the weeks that followed, Sarah had almost convinced herself that the encounter was a figment of shock and trauma, a mind's way of coping with inexplicable survival. She and Emma had moved into the old Peterson cabin that had sat empty since the family moved back east, and they'd begun the slow process of rebuilding their lives from what little they'd managed to salvage. Emma, bless her innocent heart, had adapted to their reduced circumstances with the resilience of youth. At 19, she still possessed the optimism to see their survival as evidence of divine providence rather than the random mercy of an enemy warrior. She spent her days helping Martha Kelly with the children and tending the small garden they'd planted behind the cabin, humming the same hymns that had filled their childhood home. But Sarah knew better. She'd felt the strength in that warrior's grip, had seen the intelligence in his eyes. Whatever had stayed his hand that day, it wasn't divine intervention. It was a choice, deliberate and purposeful, and choices like that always came with consequences. She'd been waiting 3 months for those consequences to arrive. The warrior stepped out of the morning shadows, like a ghost materializing from the prairie itself. Sarah had been drawing water from the well behind the Peterson cabin when she heard Chester, their old hound dog, whimpering instead of barking. Animals, she'd learned, could sense things about people that humans often missed. He stood perfectly still at the edge of the clearing, close enough that she could see the intricate beadwork on his buckskin shirt, far enough that he could disappear back into the wilderness before she could cry out for help. Not that anyone would come. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away, and most folks in these parts had learned to mind their own business when it came to Indian matters. "You know why I'm here," he said, his English precise despite the slight accent that made each word sound carefully chosen. Sarah's hands trembled as she set down the water bucket. 3 months of wandering, of jumping at shadows and starting awake from dreams filled with war cries and burning timber, and now the moment had finally arrived. She wanted to run, to scream, to pretend this confrontation wasn't happening, but something in his bearing commanded respect, even from someone who had every reason to fear him. "I know," she whispered. He reached into a leather pouch that hung from his belt and withdrew something that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. It was exquisite, a small medicine bag made of soft deer hide and decorated with intricate beadwork in blues and whites that seemed to capture the sky and clouds in thread and sinew. He held it carefully, reverently, as if it contained something precious beyond measure. "Among my people," he said, "when one person saves another's life, a debt is created, not of money or goods, but of spirit. The saved life becomes bound to the one who offered salvation." Sarah found her voice, though it came out rougher than she intended. "I never asked you to save me." "No," he agreed, "you did not. But when I saw you there, pressed against the burning wood, speaking your death prayers, I made a choice. Choices have consequences." "What kind of consequences?" He studied her face with those dark, intelligent eyes, as if reading something written there in a language she didn't understand. "You have a sister." It wasn't a question, and the certainty in his voice made Sarah's blood run cold. "Emma has nothing to do with this. Whatever debt you think I owe, it's mine alone. Your sister is unmarried, pure." The word hung between them like a physical presence. Sarah felt something fierce and protective rise up in her chest, the same instinct that had driven her to shield Emma during the raid, that had kept her awake nights worrying about their future in this harsh country. "She's just a child," Sarah said, knowing even as she spoke that it wasn't entirely true. Emma was 19, old enough to marry by any frontier standard, old enough to understand the brutalities of life in ways that their sheltered Pennsylvania upbringing had never prepared either of them for. "She is a woman," the warrior corrected gently, "and you are her protector. This makes her part of the debt." Sarah's mind raced, searching for some way out of this nightmare. "What do you want?" He held up the beaded medicine pouch, and the morning sunlight caught the intricate patterns, making them seem to dance and shift. "This belonged to my grandmother. She was a woman of great wisdom, great strength. She could see into the hearts of people, could judge their true nature. I don't understand. My grandmother believed that a man's wife should be chosen not for beauty or family connections, but for the strength of her spirit, the courage to face hardship, the wisdom to adapt and survive. The terrible understanding began to dawn on Sarah, like a cold sunrise. You want Emma to marry you. I want to know if your sister possesses the qualities my grandmother valued. If she does, then yes, she will become my wife. This will settle your debt to me. Sarah stared at him, searching his face for any sign of cruelty or lust, but found neither. There was something almost clinical in his assessment, as if he were discussing the purchase of a horse or the negotiation of a trade agreement. Somehow, that made it worse. And if I refuse? He was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah heard the wind moving through the prairie grass, the distant lowing of cattle, the ordinary sounds of a world that seemed to have no place for the impossible conversation they were having. Then you will have broken a sacred trust, he said finally. Among my people, such things have consequences that reach beyond the individuals involved. Your settlement, your neighbors, your sister, all would be touched by the dishonor. Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, as if the very earth were betraying her. You're threatening us. I am explaining the nature of honor. You asked for my protection, and I gave it. Now I ask for something in return. He tucked the medicine pouch back into his belt, the gesture somehow final. You have 7 days to decide. On the 8th day, I will return for your answer. Before Sarah could respond, he turned and walked back toward the tree line with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in the wilderness. She watched until he disappeared into the shadows, leaving her alone with the morning sun and the terrible weight of an impossible choice. Sarah's hands shook as she watched Emma hang the wash on the line behind their cabin, the same simple task that had been interrupted by violence 3 months ago. Her sister moved with the unconscious grace of youth, humming softly as she pinned their few remaining dresses to the rope stretched between 2 cottonwood trees. Around Emma's neck hung the small wooden cross their mother had carved for her 16th birthday, a symbol of innocence that now seemed to mock Sarah with its purity. 7 days. The warrior's words echoed in Sarah's mind like a death sentence. 7 days to decide whether to sacrifice her sister's freedom to honor a debt she'd never asked to incur. 7 days to choose between Emma's future and the safety of everyone in their small settlement. Sarah? Emma's voice broke through her tortured thoughts. You look pale as milk. Are you feeling poorly? Sarah forced a smile that felt like it might crack her face. Just tired, I suppose. Didn't sleep well last night. Emma approached with the concerned expression she'd worn too often since their parents' death. The look of someone forced to grow up too quickly, but still young enough to believe that worry could solve most problems. She pressed the back of her hand to Sarah's forehead, checking for fever with the maternal instincts that had emerged after their world collapsed. No fever, Emma concluded, but you've been restless for days now. What's troubling you? Everything, Sarah wanted to say. A debt I can't repay, a choice I can't make, a future I can't protect you from. Instead, she just shook her head. Women's troubles, nothing to concern yourself with. Emma's laugh was light and musical, untainted by the darkness that had settled over Sarah's thoughts. Sister, I'm 19 years old and living on the frontier. I think I can handle whatever women's troubles you might have. The casual mention of Emma's age sent a chill through Sarah. 19, old enough to marry by any measure, old enough to bear children, old enough to make her own choices about her future, but not old enough to understand what those choices might cost, or what forces beyond her control were already shaping her destiny. Emma, Sarah said carefully, have you ever thought about marriage? Her sister's cheeks colored pink, and she busied herself with smoothing wrinkles from a damp shirt. Not seriously, mind you, but sometimes I wonder what it would be like to have a family of my own, children to raise, and a husband to care for. What kind of man would you want to marry? Emma considered the question with the earnestness she brought to all matters of importance. Someone kind, I suppose. Strong enough to protect a family, but gentle enough to be patient with children. Someone who would see me as a partner, not just a convenience. Sarah's heart ached with the knowledge that Emma's innocent dreams might never have a chance to unfold naturally. And if circumstances required you to marry someone you didn't choose yourself, for the good of the family or the community? Emma's expression grew troubled. I don't understand. Why would circumstances require such a thing? Before Sarah could answer, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. 3 riders emerged from the tree line to the east, their faces grim beneath the brims of their worn hats. Sarah recognized them immediately. Tom Henderson, whose family had survived the Apache raid by hiding in their root cellar, Pete Kowalski from the trading post, and young Billy Patterson, who'd appointed himself the settlement's unofficial scout despite being barely 22 years old. Tom Henderson dismounted and tipped his hat to both women, his expression serious. Ladies, hope we're not interrupting anything important. Not at all, Sarah replied, though her heart was beating faster. What brings you out this way? Indian sign, Pete said bluntly. He was a man who'd spent 30 years on the frontier and had no patience for diplomatic language. Billy here spotted tracks this morning, fresh ones, leading right toward your place. Emma's hand moved instinctively to the wooden cross at her throat. What kind of track? Single rider, Billy answered. Unshod horse, moving careful-like. Not in any hurry, but not trying to hide his trail either. Tom Henderson's jaw tightened. Sarah, has anyone been around here? Anyone you haven't mentioned to the rest of us? The question hung in the air like a noose waiting for a neck. Sarah could feel the weight of their collective gaze, the unspoken assumption that she would tell them everything, would trust them with whatever knowledge she possessed. But how could she explain about the debt without revealing the price? How could she describe the warrior's visit without exposing Emma to questions she wasn't ready to answer? No one's been here, Sarah lied, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. Pete spat in the dust beside his horse. Well, someone was here. Recent-like, too. Billy's good at reading sign, and he says whoever it was spent some time in that clearing by your well. Could have been anyone, Emma said quickly. Maybe someone passing through looking for water. Maybe, Tom agreed, but his tone suggested he wasn't convinced. All the same, I think it would be wise if you ladies came to stay with my family for a while, until we know what we're dealing with. Sarah's mind raced. If she left now, what would happen when the warrior returned? Would he consider their absence a rejection of his offer? Would the consequences he'd hinted at fall on the entire settlement because she'd tried to run from her obligations? That's very kind, Sarah said slowly, but we can't abandon our home every time there's a sign of Indians in the area. We'd never accomplish anything. Tom's expression darkened. Sarah, after what happened 3 months ago, I'd think you'd be more careful about taking chances. I am being careful, but I won't live in fear. The irony of her words struck her even as she spoke them. She was living in fear. Fear of the warrior's ultimatum. Fear of Emma's reaction when she learned the truth. Fear of making the wrong choice and destroying everything she'd tried to protect. Your choice, Pete said with a shrug. But if anything happens, don't expect the rest of us to come running. We've got our own families to worry about. After the men rode away, Emma stood quietly beside the wash line, her fingers worrying the wooden cross at her throat. Sarah, are you sure you're telling me everything? The question was asked gently, without accusation, but it cut through Sarah's heart like a blade. Her sister deserved the truth, deserved the chance to make her own decision about her future. But the truth would also bring terror, uncertainty, and a burden of choice that no 19-year-old should have to bear. I'm sure, Sarah lied again, and watched something in Emma's eyes change, as if her sister had heard the deception even if she couldn't name it. 6 days left. The faded tintype photograph lay hidden beneath Sarah's undergarments in the bottom drawer of the old bureau, wrapped carefully in a piece of silk that had once been part of their mother's wedding dress. Sarah unwrapped it with trembling fingers, revealing the stern faces of Jonathan and Mary Brennan, captured forever in the formal pose that daguerreotype portraiture demanded. Her father's hand rested protectively on her mother's shoulder, while Mary's eyes gazed directly into the camera with the quiet strength that had carried the family through countless hardships. Sarah traced her finger along the glass surface, remembering the day this photograph was taken in the photographer's studio in Independence, Missouri, just before they'd loaded their wagon and headed west toward what they'd believed would be a better life. Her parents had been so hopeful then, so certain that hard work and faith would be enough to build something lasting in the wilderness. "Promise me you'll look after Emma," her mother had whispered during those final fever-ridden days after the cholera outbreak 2 winters ago. "Promise me you'll keep her safe, help her find happiness." Sarah had made that promise with all the fierce devotion of a 24-year-old who believed that love could overcome any obstacle. Now, 5 days into the warrior's ultimatum, she was beginning to understand that some promises required sacrifices she'd never imagined. A soft knock at the door interrupted her troubled thoughts. "Sarah, are you in?" Emma's voice carried a note of concern that had become increasingly common over the past few days. Sarah quickly rewrapped the photograph and tucked it back into its hiding place before opening the door. "I was just organizing some things," Sarah said, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. Emma stepped into the small room they shared, her expression troubled. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." Sarah's heart clenched. "Of course, yesterday, when I was gathering kindling near the creek, I found something." Emma reached into the pocket of her apron and withdrew a small object. "This was caught on a bramble bush about 50 yards from our cabin." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Emma held a single eagle feather, pristine white with a dark tip, the kind that Apache warriors wore in their hair as symbols of honor and achievement. The feather that must have fallen from the warrior's head during his visit 3 days ago. "It's beautiful," Emma said, turning the feather over in her palm. "And it's fresh, not something that's been lying in the weather for months. Someone lost this recently." Sarah struggled to keep her expression neutral. "Could have come from any bird. Eagles fly over this area all the time." "Sarah," Emma's voice was patient but firm. "This isn't just any feather. Look at the way it's been prepared. The quill has been wrapped with sinew, and there are tiny beads worked into the binding. This belongs to someone who was very close to our home." The silence stretched between them, filled with all the words Sarah couldn't bring herself to speak. Emma's eyes searched her sister's face, looking for answers to questions she was almost afraid to ask. "The men who came yesterday," Emma continued, "they said there were tracks, fresh tracks from an unshod horse. And now this feather appears practically in our backyard. Sarah, is there something you're not telling me?" Sarah felt the weight of her parents' photograph in the drawer behind her, felt the promise she'd made to her dying mother pressing against her chest like a physical burden. How could she explain that keeping Emma safe might require betraying everything they'd been taught about honor and choice? How could she admit that the protection she'd sought to provide was about to become the very thing that threatened Emma's freedom? "Emma," Sarah said carefully, "if someone came to you and said that your future, your happiness was the price for my life, what would you say?" Emma's brow furrowed in confusion. "I don't understand. What do you mean?" "I mean, if you had to choose between your own dreams and saving someone you loved, what choice would you make?" "I'd save the person I loved, of course. But Sarah, why are you asking me such strange questions?" Sarah turned away, unable to meet her sister's trusting gaze. Through the small window, she could see the prairie stretching endlessly toward the horizon, vast and unforgiving under the late afternoon sun. Somewhere out there, the warrior was waiting for her answer, counting down the days until he could claim what he believed was rightfully his. "Sometimes," Sarah said quietly, "loving someone means making choices they won't understand. Choices that seem wrong but are the only way to keep them safe." Emma moved closer, her hand finding Sarah's shoulder. "Sister, you're frightening me. What aren't you telling me?" The feather lay between them on the small table, a silent witness to secrets that were becoming too heavy to bear. Sarah knew that Emma deserved the truth, deserved the chance to make her own decision about her future. But she also knew that once the truth was spoken, there would be no going back to the simple world where Emma could hymn hymns while hanging laundry, where her biggest worry was whether their meager savings would last through the winter. "Emma," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what if I told you that someone wanted to marry you? Someone you'd never met, someone very different from us?" Emma's laugh was nervous, uncertain. "I'd say that was impossible. We don't know any unmarried men in the area, and Father isn't here to arrange anything. Sarah, what are you trying to tell me?" Before Sarah could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the prairie. Both women turned toward the window, and Sarah's blood ran cold as she recognized the distinctive silhouette of an Apache warrior on horseback, still distant but unmistakably heading toward their cabin. "Who is that?" Emma whispered, her hand instinctively moving to the wooden cross at her throat. Sarah watched the rider approach, knowing that her time for secrets and half-truths was running out. In a few minutes, Emma would see the warrior for herself, would understand that the feather in her palm wasn't just a random discovery, but evidence of a connection that would change both their lives forever. "Emma," Sarah said, her voice heavy with the weight of approaching truth, "I need to tell you about a debt I owe." 4 days left. The warrior dismounted with fluid grace, his movements betraying none of the urgency that Sarah felt clawing at her chest. From the window she could see him clearly now, the red and black war paint marking his cheekbones in precise geometric patterns, the eagle feathers adorning his dark hair, the small clay pot hanging from his belt that seemed to gleam with some inner significance. "Sarah," Emma's voice was tight with fear. "Who is that man?" Before Sarah could answer, the warrior called out in clear English, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "Sarah Brennan, I come to speak with you." Emma's face went pale. "He knows your name." "Sarah, how does he know your name?" Sarah's mouth felt dry as dust. The moment she'd been dreading for 5 days had arrived, and she found herself completely unprepared for the reality of it. All her careful plans for how to tell Emma the truth crumbled in the face of the warrior's imposing presence. "I'll explain everything," Sarah whispered, "but first I need to speak with him." She stepped outside, feeling Emma's frightened gaze on her back. The warrior stood beside his horse, a magnificent paint stallion that seemed as calm and controlled as its rider. Up close, Sarah could see the intricate beadwork on his buckskin shirt, the careful craftsmanship of his weapons, the intelligence in his dark eyes that suggested depths of knowledge she couldn't fathom. "You remember me," he said, and it wasn't a question. "I remember." He reached for the clay pot at his belt, handling it with the reverence one might show a sacred relic. The pot was small enough to fit in his palm, made of red clay and decorated with symbols that seemed to dance and shift in the afternoon light. When he opened it, Sarah caught a glimpse of crimson powder inside, war paint. She realized, but something more than that, something that held meaning beyond mere decoration. "This belonged to my grandfather," the warrior said, his voice taking on a formal cadence that suggested ritual and tradition. "He was a war chief, a man who led our people through many battles against enemies who would take our land, our children, our way of life." Sarah found herself transfixed by the pot and the story it represented. Despite her fear, despite the impossible situation he'd thrust her into, she couldn't deny the dignity of his bearing, the weight of history he carried in his words. "Before each battle," he continued, "my grandfather would mark his face with this paint and speak to the spirits of his ancestors. He believed that honor was the only currency mattered between life and death, that a man's word was worth more than gold or horses or land." "What does this have to do with my sister?" "Everything." He dipped his finger into the red powder and drew a line across his forehead with deliberate precision. "When I saved your life, I acted according to the code my grandfather taught me. A warrior protects those who cannot protect themselves, even if they are not of his people." Sarah watched the ritual with growing unease. There was something final about the way he applied the paint, as if he were preparing for something that required the blessing of his ancestors. But protection creates obligation, he said, adding another line to his cheek. Among my people, when a life is saved, the saved person becomes part of the Savior's family, not as a slave, but as a relative, with all the duties and privileges that relationship entails. My sister doesn't understand your customs. Then she will learn. He capped the clay pot and returned it to his belt. I am Ayana of the Chiricahua Apache. I have 32 horses, land enough for a large family, and the respect of my people. Your sister would want for nothing as my wife. The casual certainty in his voice made Sarah's anger flare. She's not property to be traded. No, he agreed, she is not. That is why I am here to speak with her, to let her see the man who would become her husband, to allow her to understand what life she would have among my people. Behind Sarah, the cabin door opened with a soft creak. Emma stepped onto the porch, her hand gripping the wooden cross at her throat so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. The afternoon sun caught the gold in her brown hair, made her skin seem to glow with the luminous quality that had always made people comment on her beauty. Ayana's expression shifted subtly as he looked at Emma for the first time. Sarah saw something like surprise cross his features, followed by what might have been approval. Emma, for her part, stood frozen on the porch, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. You are Emma, Ayana said, his voice gentling slightly. Emma's voice came out as barely a whisper. Yes, I am Ayana. Your sister owes me a debt. What kind of debt? Sarah started to step between them, but Ayana raised a hand that somehow commanded her to stop. When he spoke, his words were directed to Emma alone. The debt of life for life. I saved your sister when my people attacked your settlement. Now she must repay that debt. Emma's confused gaze moved between Ayana and Sarah. I don't understand. What does my sister's debt have to do with me? You are the payment I require. The words fell between them like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that Sarah could see spreading across Emma's face. Her sister's hand tightened on the cross, and for a moment Sarah thought Emma might faint. Payment, Emma's voice was barely audible. Marriage, Ayana said simply. You would become my wife, bear my children, share my life among the Apache people. This would settle your sister's debt completely. Emma swayed on her feet, and Sarah moved quickly to steady her. But Emma pushed away from her sister's support, her eyes never leaving Ayana's face. And if I refuse, then your sister remains in debt to me, and that debt will be passed to your children and your children's children until it is satisfied. Sarah felt the world tilting around her as she watched her sister process this impossible choice. Emma's face went through a series of expressions: shock, fear, confusion, and then something else that Sarah couldn't quite identify. Something that looked almost like curiosity. How long do I have to decide? Emma asked, her voice growing stronger. 3 days, Ayana replied. After that, I will require an answer. As he mounted his horse and rode away, Sarah saw Emma's fingers release their grip on the wooden cross. For the first time since the conversation began, her sister looked directly at her. Sarah, Emma said quietly, I think you and I need to have a very long talk. Emma sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that Sarah could see the white of her knuckles. The silence between them stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Outside, the sun was setting behind the cottonwood trees, casting long shadows across the floor, where Sarah paced back and forth like a caged animal. 3 months, Emma said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. You've known about this debt for 3 months, and you said nothing. Sarah stopped pacing and turned to face her sister. What was I supposed to say? That an Apache warrior saved my life, and now he wants to claim you as payment. Would you have understood? Would you have been able to sleep at night, knowing what was coming? That wasn't your choice to make. Emma's voice was growing stronger, edged with an anger that Sarah had rarely heard from her gentle sister. I'm not a child, Sarah. I deserve to know when my future is being decided by others. Sarah sank into the chair across from Emma, suddenly feeling every one of her 27 years. I was trying to protect you. Protect me from what? From the truth? From having a say in my own fate? Emma's eyes flashed with a fire that reminded Sarah painfully of their mother during her rare moments of righteous indignation. What kind of protection is it to lie to someone about something this important? The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She reached into her apron pocket and withdrew the crumpled letter she'd been working on for days. The desperate attempt to find help that had been interrupted by Tom Henderson's visit. The paper was worn soft from repeated folding and unfolding, stained with tears she'd tried to hide from Emma. I wrote to Aunt Constance in Philadelphia, Sarah said, smoothing the torn letter on the table between them. I was going to ask if we could come stay with her, if she could help us find some way out of this situation. Emma looked at the partial letter, taking in the shaky handwriting and the desperate tone that bled through even Sarah's carefully chosen words. What did she say? I never sent it. Sarah's voice cracked. What could I tell her? That we need to run from an Apache warrior because I owe him a debt I can't repay. That her nieces have become entangled in something she'd never understand. Emma reached across the table and touched the letter with gentle fingers. Dear Aunt Constance, she read aloud, I hope this letter finds you in good health. Emma and I are facing some difficulties here in the territories, and I wondered if you might have room for us in your home until we can find more suitable arrangements. Sarah watched Emma's face as she read, seeing her sister process the careful euphemisms and diplomatic language that couldn't begin to convey the reality of their situation. You make it sound like we're having trouble with the harvest, Emma said softly. Not like we're running from a marriage proposal that could determine the fate of our entire settlement. I didn't know how to explain it in a way that wouldn't sound like madness. Emma set the letter aside and looked directly at Sarah, her brown eyes reflecting a maturity that seemed to have appeared overnight. Tell me about him, about Ayanna, not about the debt or the customs or the danger. Tell me about the man who saved your life. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, remembering that terrible day when smoke filled her lungs and flames licked at her skirts. He could have let me die. It would have been easier for him, safer. His people were retreating, and stopping to save an enemy put him at risk. But he stopped anyway. Yes, and when he spoke to me, his voice was calm, kind even. He wasn't cruel or savage or any of the things the newspapers say about Apache warriors. He was just a man making a choice to preserve life instead of taking it. Emma absorbed this information with the careful attention she'd always brought to important matters. What did you see in his eyes? Intelligence, honor, a kind of sadness maybe, as if he understood the cost of the choice he was making, but felt bound to make it anyway. And today, when he spoke to me, Sarah hesitated, uncertain how much truth Emma was ready to hear. He looked at you like you were someone worthy of respect, not like property or a prize to be won, but like a person whose opinion mattered to him. Emma stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the darkening prairie where Ayanna had disappeared hours earlier. He's handsome, she said quietly. Emma, I'm not blind, Sarah. I saw his face, his bearing. He carries himself like a man accustomed to being listened to being followed. Emma turned back to face her sister. What kind of life would I have among his people? Sarah's heart clenched. I don't know. Different from anything we've ever imagined. Harder in some ways, perhaps freer in others. Would I be safe? I think so. He spoke of marriage, not captivity. Among the Apache, wives have rights and responsibilities that are different from ours, but not necessarily lesser. Emma returned to the table and picked up the unfinished letter again. If I married him, what would happen to you? The debt would be satisfied. I'd be free to make my own choices about my future. And if I refused, Sarah felt the weight of Ayanna's warning pressing down on her. He says the debt would pass to future generations. that our children and our children's children would be bound by what happened between us. Emma was quiet for so long that Sarah began to worry. When her sister finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful rather than frightened. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." "Of course." "If our positions were reversed, if you were 19 and unmarried and I had incurred this debt, what would you do?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Sarah thought about their parents, about the values they'd been raised with, about the promises she'd made to protect Emma from the harsh realities of frontier. But she also thought about the woman Emma was becoming, about the strength and intelligence that had always lurked beneath her sister's gentle exterior. "I would want to make my own choice," Sarah said finally. "I would want to understand all my options and decide for myself what kind of future I could live with." Emma smiled for the first time since Ayana's visit, an expression that was both grateful and sad. "Then that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to learn everything I can about this man and his people, and then I'm going to make a decision based on what I think is right, not on what anyone else thinks I should do." Sarah felt something shift between them, a recognition that the protective dynamic that had defined their relationship since their parents' death was evolving into something more equal, more honest. "What do you need from me?" Sarah asked. Emma folded the torn letter carefully and handed it back to Sarah. "I need you to trust me to handle this like the adult I am, and I need you to stop trying to carry burdens that belong to both of us." Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, its voice echoing across the prairie like a reminder that they were living in a world where the old rules didn't always apply. Sarah looked at her sister and saw not the innocent girl she'd been trying to protect, but a woman capable of facing difficult truths and making hard choices. 2 days left. Ayana returned at dawn, emerging from the morning mist like a figure from a dream. Emma had been awake for hours, standing at the kitchen window and watching the eastern horizon lighten from black to grey to pale gold. When she saw him approaching on foot this time, leading his paint horse by a simple rope halter, she felt her heart begin to race with something that wasn't entirely fear. "He's back," she called softly to Sarah, who was stoking the fire in their small cooking stove. Sarah joined her at the window, and Emma felt her sister's tension like a physical presence. "You don't have to speak with him if you're not ready." "I want to." The words surprised Emma with their certainty. "I need to understand who he is, not just what he represents." Emma stepped outside into the cool morning air, wrapping her woolen shawl more tightly around her shoulders. Ayana stopped about 20 feet from the cabin, close enough for conversation but far enough to show respect for her space. In the morning light, without the dramatic backdrop of his sudden appearance, he looked more human somehow, still imposing, still undeniably foreign to her experience, but less like a figure from a nightmare and more like a man with his own concerns and motivation. "You slept poorly," he observed, his dark eyes taking in the shadows beneath her eyes. "You can tell that from looking at me. My grandmother taught me to read faces. Worry leaves marks that cannot be hidden." Emma found herself curious about this grandmother he'd mentioned twice now. "Tell me about her." Ayana tethered his horse to the fence post near their well and withdrew something from his saddlebag, a folded length of woven wool in rich browns and deep blues, patterns that seemed to shift and change as the light caught them. He handled it with obvious reverence, the way Emma might handle her mother's good china. "This belonged to her," he said, shaking out the blanket to reveal its full beauty. "She wove it during the winter before she died, when her hands were already growing stiff with age, but her skill remained true. The blanket was exquisite, far finer than anything Emma had ever seen. The patterns weren't random decorations, but seemed to tell a story in thread and color, mountains and rivers, animals and seasons, the cycle of life rendered in wool and dye. "It's beautiful," Emma said, meaning it. "She made it for the woman who would become my wife. She said that a marriage blanket should be strong enough to keep out the cold wind, but soft enough to wrap around newborn children." Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks at the mention of children, but she didn't look away from his steady gaze. "What was she like?" "Your grandmother." Wise, stubborn, she had strong opinions about everything and wasn't afraid to share them. Ayana's mouth curved in what might have been the ghost of a smile. She said that a man who chose his wife for beauty alone would find himself married to an empty lodge when age took that beauty away. What should he choose her for instead? Strength of spirit, intelligence, the ability to adapt when life becomes difficult. He paused, studying Emma's face with that same assessing look she'd noticed the day before. The courage to make hard choices when they must be made. Emma pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders, partly against the morning chill and partly as a kind of armor against the intensity of his attention. "You're testing me. I am learning you. There is a difference. What have you learned so far?" Ayana was quiet for a moment, considering his words with the care of someone accustomed to weighing the impact of what he said. "That you are not the frightened child your sister believes you to be. That you ask questions instead of simply accepting what you are told. That you came outside to speak with me despite your fear." "I am afraid," Emma admitted. "But fear doesn't have to control my choices." "No," he agreed. "It does not." He folded the blanket carefully and set it on the ground between them, a gesture that seemed significant, though Emma couldn't interpret its meaning. "Among my people, when a man wishes to court a woman, he brings gifts to show his ability to provide for her, not to buy her acceptance, but to demonstrate his respect for her worth." Emma looked at the blanket, understanding dawning slowly. "You're courting me. I am trying to help you understand what your life would be among the Apache. What I could offer you as a husband." The word husband hung in the air between them, strange and weighty. Emma had imagined marriage in abstract terms, someday, to someone when the right person appeared and circumstances aligned. She'd never considered that her husband might be chosen through circumstances beyond her control, or that he might be someone so completely outside her experience. "What would you expect from a wife?" she asked. "Partnership, loyalty, children, if the spirits are willing." He paused. "Respect, but not submission. Apache women are not silent ornaments in their husbands' lodges." Emma found herself thinking of the women in their small settlement. Miss Henderson, who deferred to her husband's opinions on everything from the weather to the price of grain. Martha Kelly, who had become invisible after her husband's death, as if widowhood had erased her individual identity. The picture Ayana painted was different, unfamiliar but not entirely unappealing. "Would I be safe among your people? You would be my wife. That would make you family, not captive. Anyone who harmed you would answer to me." The quiet certainty in his voice sent an unexpected shiver through Emma. There was something both thrilling and terrifying about the idea of being under such protection, of mattering that much to someone she barely knew. "And if I couldn't adapt? If I tried but failed to fit into your world?" For the first time since she'd known him, Ayana's confident expression wavered slightly. "Then we would both live with the consequences of that failure." The honesty of his answer struck Emma more powerfully than any reassurance could have. He wasn't promising her an easy life or a perfect marriage. He was offering her a choice with real stakes, real risks, and real rewards. Behind her, Emma heard the cabin door open and Sarah's footsteps on the wooden porch. But for once, her sister's presence didn't make Emma feel like a child in need of protection. Instead, she felt like a woman capable of having a conversation about her own future. "I need time to think," Emma said. "Time is something I can give you," Ayana replied. "Until tomorrow at sunset." He mounted his horse with fluid grace, but before riding away, he gestured toward the blanket he'd left on the ground. "That is yours now, whether you choose to become my wife or not. A gift given freely, with no obligation attached." After he disappeared into the morning haze, Emma knelt and touched the soft wool of the marriage blanket. The patterns seemed to come alive under her fingers, telling stories of a world she'd never imagined, but was beginning to think she might want to understand. One day left. Sarah stared at the yellow telegram in her trembling hands, the words swimming before her eyes, as if the paper itself were burning. She'd ridden to the trading post at first light, desperate for any word from the outside world that might offer salvation or, at least, guidance. Instead, Pete Kowalski had handed her this crushing message that destroyed her last hope for external intervention. Regret cannot assist with Indian matters. Stop territorial disputes outside federal jurisdiction. Stop suggest local resolution. Stop fort garrison commander. Emma sat across from her at their small kitchen table, Ayana's marriage blanket folded carefully beside her plate. The contrast was stark. The military's cold dismissal in Sarah's hands, and the intimate gift that represented a very different kind of future in Emma's lap. "They won't help," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "The army considers this a private matter between individuals, not a threat to territorial security." Emma nodded, her expression thoughtful rather than surprised. "I didn't expect they would. This isn't about war or raids or territorial boundaries. About honor and debt and personal obligation." "How can you be so calm about this?" Sarah's voice cracked with frustration and fear. "In less than 24 hours you have to give that man an answer that will determine the rest of your life, and you're sitting there like we're discussing the weather." Emma smoothed her hand over the woven patterns of the blanket, her fingers tracing the intricate designs with growing familiarity. "Because panic won't change anything, Sarah, and because I've been thinking about what kind of woman I want to be." "What do you mean?" "I mean that for 19 years. Other people have made decisions about my future. First mother and father, then you after they died. Everyone has been so concerned with protecting me, keeping me safe, making sure I don't have to face anything difficult or frightening." Emma's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "But maybe being protected from every hard choice isn't the same thing as being loved." Sarah felt the words like a physical blow. "Everything I've done has been to keep you safe." "I know, and I'm grateful for that." "But Sarah, what if safety isn't the most important thing? What if there are things worth risking safety for?" Through the window, Sarah could see their neighbors going about their morning routines. Tom Henderson checking his fence line, old Pete loading supplies onto his wagon, Martha Kelly hanging wash with the mechanical precision of someone trying to fill empty hours. The ordinariness of it all felt surreal against the magnitude of the choice Emma faced. "Like what?" Sarah asked. "What could possibly be worth risking everything we know?" Emma stood and walked to the window, the blanket draped over her arm like a banner. "Purpose, maybe. The chance to build something new instead of just surviving in what's left of something old. The possibility of being valued for who I am, rather than being sheltered because of who I'm not." "Emma, you're talking about marrying a man you've met twice. A man from a completely different world who speaks a different language and follows customs we don't understand." "Yes," Emma said simply. "I am." The certainty in her voice made Sarah's stomach clench with dread. "You've already decided, haven't you?" Emma turned from the window, and Sarah saw something in her sister's face that she'd never noticed before, a strength that went deeper than gentleness, a resolve that had nothing to do with stubbornness and everything to do with genuine courage. "I've decided that I want to make this choice for myself, based on what I think is right rather than what anyone else thinks I should do." Emma returned to the table and sat down across from Sarah. "But I need to know something first. What if I choose to marry Ayana? Will you be able to forgive me for leaving you alone?" The question cut straight to the heart of Sarah's fear. Not just that Emma would make this impossible choice, but that in doing so she would abandon the bonds that had held them together through loss and hardship. Sarah thought about the empty cabin she'd returned to each evening, the silence that would replace Emma's humming, the absence of someone who needed her protection and care. But she also thought about Emma's face when she looked at Ayana's blanket, the way her sister's voice had changed when she talked about purpose and possibility. She thought about their mother's dying words about helping Emma find happiness, and realized that perhaps happiness didn't always look the way she'd imagined it would. "Emma," Sarah said carefully, "what would you need from me if you decided to accept his proposal?" "Your blessing. Your understanding that this isn't about rejecting our family or our past, but about choosing my future." Sarah looked at the telegram again, its official language suddenly seeming less like a crushing disappointment and more like a clear message that the solutions to their problems wouldn't come from distant authorities or familiar institutions. Sometimes the only way forward was through uncharted territory. And if you decided to refuse? Emma's smile was sad but genuine. Then we'd find another way, together. But Sarah, I need you to know that refusing wouldn't be about choosing safety over risk. It would be about choosing a different kind of risk. The risk of always wondering what might have been. Outside, the sun was climbing toward its zenith, marking the passage of precious hours. Sarah folded the telegram and set it aside, recognizing that whatever decision Emma made, their old life, the one where Sarah's job was to protect and Emma's role was to be protected, was ending. "Tell me what you're thinking," Sarah said. "Really thinking, not what you think I want to hear." Emma smoothed the blanket one more time, her expression growing distant. "I'm thinking that Ayana didn't have to offer me a choice. According to his customs, I was already bound to him through your death. But he's taking the time to court me, to help me understand what my life would be like, to give me the chance to choose freely. That doesn't mean the choice is easy." "No," Emma agreed. "But it means he respects me enough to want a willing wife, rather than a resentful obligation. And I find myself wondering what it would be like to be married to a man who sees me as someone worth convincing, rather than someone worth commanding." Sarah heard the unspoken comparison to the limited options available to unmarried women in their settlement. Marriage to one of the few available men regardless of compatibility, or a lifetime of dependence on relatives who might or might not welcome the burden. "Are you afraid?" Sarah asked, terrified. Emma admitted, but also curious. "And I'm tired of letting fear make my decisions for me." As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Sarah realized that her little sister had already grown into someone capable of making adult choices about an adult life. The only question now was whether Sarah could find the courage to support whatever decision Emma made. Sunset was still hours away, but Sarah could feel time running out like sand through her fingers. The eagle feather rested in Emma's palm like a whispered secret, its pristine white surface catching the afternoon light that streamed through their cabin window. Ayana had given it to her just an hour ago, along with words that had shaken her understanding of herself and the choice she faced. "Among my people," he had said, his voice carrying the weight of ancient tradition, "the eagle is sacred because it flies closest to the Creator. When an eagle gives up one of its feathers, it offers a piece of its connection to the divine." Emma turned the feather slowly, examining the intricate way the individual barbs locked together to create something both strong and delicate. The quill had been wrapped with sinew in a spiral pattern, and tiny blue beads had been worked into the binding, the same shade of blue as the summer sky reflected in still water. "What does it mean when someone gives you an eagle feather?" she had asked. "It means they see the sacred in you. It means they believe you are worthy of carrying a piece of the sky." Now alone in the cabin while Sarah gathered eggs from their small chicken coop, Emma contemplated the weight of that gift. Not the physical weight, the feather was almost weightless in her hand, but the spiritual significance that Ayana had tried to help her understand. "The eagle sees everything from above," he had explained. "It understands patterns that those on the ground cannot perceive. When you hold that feather, you hold the eagle's vision, the ability to see your life from a great height, to understand how all the pieces fit together." Emma closed her eyes and tried to imagine herself from that elevated perspective. She saw a young woman standing at the crossroads between two rules, neither of which offered guarantees or easy answers. In one direction lay the familiar path, marriage to a local man if one could be found, a life of conventional domestic duties, the gradual narrowing of possibilities that seemed to come with age and circumstances on the frontier. In the other direction lay territory as unmapped as the western wilderness itself. Marriage to a man whose culture she barely understood. A life among people who might never fully accept her. The constant challenge of adaptation and the risk of complete failure. But from the eagle's height, Emma thought she could see something else. The possibility that the choice itself mattered more than the specific direction she chose. That perhaps courage lay not in making the safe decision or even the right decision, but in making a decision that honored her own agency rather than deferring to others' fears. Sarah's footsteps on the porch interrupted her meditation. Her sister entered with a basket of eggs and an expression of carefully controlled anxiety that had become her default since Ayana's first visit. "He came back while you were gone," Emma said without looking up from the feather. Sarah set down the basket with unnecessary force. "What did he want? To give me this?" Emma held up the eagle feather, watching Sarah's face as she recognized its significance. "And to tell me about his grandmother's vision." "What vision?" Emma stood and walked to the window, the feather still cradled in her palm. "She told him that he would know his true wife because she would be willing to fly with him into unknown territory. Not because she was fearless, but because she trusted her own wings." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and Emma could almost hear her sister's mind working through the implication. "Emma, please tell me you're not making this decision based on some romantic notion about eagles and flying." Emma turned to face her sister, surprised by the calmness in her own voice. "I'm making this decision based on what I've learned about myself in the past few days, about what kind of woman I want to be and what kind of life I think I could live with." "And what have you learned?" "That I'm tired of being protected from my own choices. That I would rather risk failing at something difficult than succeed at something that doesn't challenge me." Emma moved closer to Sarah, hoping her sister could see the sincerity in her eyes. "That maybe the debt Ayana claims isn't really about payment at all, but about recognizing when an opportunity appears disguised as an obligation." Sarah sank into one of their kitchen chairs, her face pale with understanding. "You're going to say yes?" "I think so. But Sarah, I need you to understand something important." "What?" Emma knelt beside her sister's chair, the eagle feather held between them like a bridge between worlds. "If I marry Ayana, it won't be because I'm trying to save you from your debt or because I feel trapped by circumstances. It will be because I think this might be my chance to become someone I've never had the opportunity to be." "Who?" "A woman who makes her own choices about her own life. A person who is valued for her strength rather than sheltered because of her supposed weakness." Emma's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "Someone who helps build something new rather than just maintaining something old." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and Emma saw in them not just grief for the loss of the life they'd shared, but a kind of proud recognition of the woman Emma was becoming. "Are you sure?" Sarah whispered. "No," Emma admitted. "I'm not sure about anything except that I want to find out what happens when I trust my own judgment about something this important." She stood and walked to the small mirror that hung beside their wash basin, studying her reflection while she worked the eagle feather into her brown hair. The white stood out starkly against the darker strands, a visible symbol of the choice she was preparing to make. "How do I look?" she asked. Sarah joined her at the mirror, and for a moment they stood side by side as they had countless times before. But Emma could see that something fundamental had shifted between them. The protective older sister and the sheltered younger one were transforming into two women who respected each other's right to choose their own paths. "You look like someone ready to fly," Sarah said quietly. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. In a few hours, Ayana would return for her answer, and Emma would speak words that would change not just her future, but her understanding of who she was capable of being. The eagle feather caught the light from the window, its surface seeming to shimmer with possibilities that extended far beyond the boundaries of the small world she'd always known. Sarah's hands shook as she worked the gold band from her finger, the wedding ring that had been their mother's most precious possession. The metal was worn smooth from years of wear, the simple design made precious not by its material value, but by the love it represented. Mary Brennan had worn this ring through childbirth and illness, through droughts and good harvests, through the countless small struggles and victories that made up a frontier marriage. "Please," Sarah whispered to Ayanna, holding the ring out to him with desperate hope. "Take this instead. It belonged to my mother, and her mother before that. It's worth more to our family than anything else we own." Ayanna stood perfectly still in the fading afternoon light, his dark eyes moving from the ring to Sarah's face, with something that might have been compassion. Behind him, his paint horse grazed peacefully in their small yard, oblivious to the human drama unfolding nearby. "Your mother's ring is beautiful," he said gently, "but it cannot satisfy the debt between us." "Why not?" Sarah's voice cracked with desperation. "You said the debt was about honor, about repaying what I owe you for saving my life. This ring represents everything my family holds sacred. How could that not be enough?" Emma emerged from the cabin, her movements deliberate and calm, despite the tension crackling in the air around them. The eagle feather was woven into her hair, its white surface catching the golden light of approaching sunset. She looked, Sarah thought, with a mixture of pride and heartbreak, like a young woman who had found her courage and intended to use it. "Because," Emma said quietly, approaching the two of them with steady steps, "the debt isn't really about payment at all, is it? Ayanna?" The Apache warrior turned his attention to Emma, and Sarah saw something shift in his expression, a recognition that surprised him with its intensity. "Explain what you mean," he said. Emma stopped a few feet away from both of them, close enough for conversation but maintaining a distance that spoke of her newfound independence. "Yesterday you told me about your grandmother's wisdom, about how she believed a man should choose his wife based on the strength of her spirit. Today you gave me an eagle feather and spoke about the courage to fly into unknown territory." Sarah watched this exchange with growing confusion and dread. There was something happening between Emma and Ayanna that went beyond the formal negotiation of debt and obligation, something that made her feel like an outsider to her own sister's transformation. "Those were gifts freely given," Ayanna said carefully. "Were they?" Emma's voice carried a new authority that Sarah barely recognized. "Or were they tests? Ways of seeing whether I possessed the qualities your grandmother valued in a wife?" Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, his gaze never leaving Emma's face. "You see clearly. I see that a man who truly believed in taking women as payment for debts wouldn't spend time courting them. He wouldn't bring marriage blankets and sacred feathers and stories about grandmothers who valued wisdom over beauty." Emma's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "A man like that would simply claim what he believed was owed and be done with it." Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as she began to understand what Emma was suggesting. "You think this was all a deception?" "Not a deception," Emma said, her eyes still locked with Ayanna's. "He needed to know if I was someone worth marrying, not just someone he could force into marriage." Ayanna nodded slowly, something like respect flickering in his expression. "My grandmother always said that a forced marriage produces only children who understand force, not love." "But the debt," Sarah began. "The debt is real," Ayanna interrupted. "But among my people, when someone saves a life, the obligation is not to surrender something precious in return. The obligation is to live in a way that honors the gift of continued existence." Sarah stared at him, struggling to process this revelation. "Then why demand Emma's hand in marriage?" "Because," Emma answered before Ayanna could speak, "he needed a way to approach me that didn't depend on my accepting him immediately. He needed time to show me who he was and to learn who I might become." Ayanna reached into his medicine pouch and withdrew something Sarah hadn't seen before. A second ring, this one made of silver and turquoise, crafted in a style that spoke of Apache artistry. He held it up so both women could see the intricate patterns worked into the metal. "This belonged to my grandmother," he said. "She wore it for 60 years of marriage to my grandfather." Before she died, she told me to give it only to a woman who chose freely to wear it, who understood that marriage should be a partnership between equals rather than a transaction between families. Emma stepped forward, her hand extended not to take the ring but to touch Ayana's wrist with gentle fingers. And if I had chosen differently, if I had been too frightened or unwilling to consider your proposal, then the debt would have been satisfied by your sister's demonstrated love and courage in trying to protect you. Sometimes the greatest honor comes not from getting what we want, but from discovering what we're willing to sacrifice for others. Sarah sank onto the wooden steps of their cabin, her mother's ring still clutched in her palm. The relief flooding through her was so intense it left her dizzy, but it was accompanied by a deeper realization that changed everything she thought she understood about the past few days. "Emma," she whispered, "you knew. You figured this out before now." Her sister turned to face her, and Sarah saw in Emma's expression a kindness that was entirely adult, entirely self-possessed. "I suspect, but I needed to be sure, and I needed to make the choice for myself rather than having it explained to me by someone else." Emma looked back at Ayana, her hand still resting lightly on his wrist. "The question now isn't whether I'm obligated to marry you. The question is whether I want to." The silence that followed was filled with possibilities that Sarah was only beginning to understand. Her little sister, the girl she'd spent years protecting from difficult choices, was about to make the most important decision of her life, with a clarity and courage that took Sarah's breath away. The sun touched the horizon, painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, and Sarah realized that whatever Emma decided, the woman who emerged from this moment would be someone entirely new, someone who had chosen her own path, based on her own understanding of what it meant to live a life worth saving. The Apache courtship bracelet rested in Emma's palm like a coiled promise, its intricate silver work and turquoise stones catching the last rays of sunlight. Ayana had presented it to her with ceremony, explaining that among his people, when a woman accepted such a bracelet, she was announcing her willingness to be courted with the intention of marriage. "I understand what this means," Emma said, her voice steady, despite the magnitude of the moment. "If I put this on, I'm saying yes to becoming your wife." Ayana nodded, his expression serious but hopeful. "You are saying yes to trying, to learning whether we can build a life together that honors both of our peoples." Sarah watched from the cabin steps, her mother's wedding ring still clutched in her hand, as Emma examined the bracelet with the careful attention she'd always given to important decisions. The silver was worked in patterns that seemed to tell a story, spirals that might represent the cycle of seasons, geometric shapes that could symbolize the connection between earth and sky. "It's beautiful," Emma said softly, "but I need you both to understand something before I make this choice." She looked first at Ayana, then at Sarah, her brown eyes reflecting a determination that seemed to have emerged fully formed over the past few days. "I'm not accepting this proposal because I feel trapped by circumstances or because I think it's my duty to save Sarah from an impossible debt. I'm accepting it because I believe you're offering me something I've never had before. The chance to be valued for who I am rather than protected from who I might become." Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. "Emma, are you certain? This changes everything." "I know." Emma's voice was gentle, but firm. "And I want everything to change. I want to find out what kind of woman I can be when I'm not being sheltered from difficult choices." She slipped the bracelet over her wrist, the silver warm against her skin from Ayana's touch. The moment the clasp closed, Sarah saw something shift in both Emma and Ayana, a recognition that they had crossed a threshold from which there would be no easy return. "When?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. 7 days, Ayana replied. "Enough time to prepare, to say proper farewells, to gather what Emma wishes to bring to her new life." Emma stood and walked to where Sarah sat on the cabin steps, kneeling beside her sister and taking her hands. "Sarah, I need you to understand that this isn't about leaving you behind. It's about growing into someone who can stand beside you as an equal, rather than someone who needs your constant protection." Sarah looked into her sister's face and saw not the frightened girl she'd been trying to shield from the world's harshness, but a young woman who had found her courage and intended to use it. The transformation was both heartbreaking and beautiful. "What will people say?" Sarah whispered. "What will the community think when they learn you're marrying an Apache warrior?" Before Emma could answer, the sound of multiple horses approaching echoed across the prairie. Sarah looked up to see a group of riders emerging from the tree line. Tom Henderson, Pete Kowalski, Billy Patterson, and several other men from their settlement, all armed and wearing the grim expressions of people who had come to settle a problem with violence. Tom Henderson dismounted and approached them with the deliberate stride of someone who believed he was acting with righteous authority. His rifle remained in its saddle holster, but his hand rested on his pistol grip in a gesture that was impossible to misinterpret. "Sarah, Emma, step away from the Indian," Tom commanded, his voice carrying the assumption that his word would be obeyed without question. Emma rose to her feet but didn't move away from Iona. Instead, she positioned herself slightly in front of him, a gesture that spoke of protection rather than fear. "Tom, this isn't your concern," Emma said calmly. "Like hell it isn't." Pete Kowalski spat in the dust beside his horse. "We've been patient long enough with this situation. It's time to send this savage back where he came from." Sarah stood, her heart pounding with the recognition that the careful balance they'd maintained for the past week was about to collapse into violence. "Please, all of you, just listen. We're done listening," Billy Patterson interrupted. "We know what's been going on here. We know this Apache has been threatening you, trying to force some kind of arrangement. Well, we're here to put an end to it." Iona moved with fluid grace, stepping slightly to the side so that Emma was no longer between him and the armed men. His hands remained visible and empty, but Sarah could see the coiled readiness in his posture, the preparation for violence that he hoped to avoid, but would not shrink from if necessary. "There is no threat here," Iona said, his voice calm despite the tension crackling in the air. "Only a man asking a woman to share his life." Tom Henderson's laugh was harsh and disbelieving. "You expect us to believe that? You expect us to stand by while you carry off one of our women like some kind of prize?" "I'm not being carried off," Emma said, her voice rising with indignation. "I'm making a choice. My choice." She held up her wrist, displaying the silver bracelet that caught the dying light like a beacon. "I've accepted Iona's proposal. We're going to be married." The silence that followed was broken only by the restless movement of horses and the distant sound of wind moving through prairie grass. Sarah watched the men's faces cycle through shock, disbelief and growing anger as they processed Emma's announcement. "Emma," Tom Henderson said slowly, "you don't know what you're saying. This savage has obviously threatened you, or confused you, or..." "No one has threatened me," Emma interrupted, her voice sharp with authority that surprised everyone present. "And I'm not confused. I'm a grown woman making a decision about my own future." Pete Kowalski's hand moved to his gun. "Well, we're not going to let that happen." The moment balanced on a knife's edge, with violence and bloodshed seeming inevitable. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, as she realized that her next words might determine whether this confrontation ended in tragedy or understanding. But before she could speak, Emma stepped forward, the Apache bracelet gleaming on her wrist like a declaration of war against everything the settlement thought it knew about proper behavior and acceptable choices. "Then you'll have to go through me," Emma said quietly, "because I'm not changing my mind." The loaded rifle lay across Tom Henderson's saddle like a promise of violence, its polished barrel reflecting the dying light of sunset. Sarah could see the determination in the faces of the mounted men, Pete Kowalski's weathered features set in grim resolve, Billy Patterson's young face flushed with righteous anger, and behind them, 4 more settlers who had appointed themselves the arbiters of what was acceptable in their small community. "Emma, step away from the Indian," Tom repeated, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "We're here to put an end to this madness before someone gets hurt." Emma remained perfectly still, the Apache bracelet gleaming on her wrist like armor against their disapproval. The only madness here is the idea that you have any right to make decisions about my life. Sarah watched her sister with a mixture of pride and terror. Emma had found her courage, but courage without wisdom could lead to tragedy just as easily as cowardice could lead to regret. Emma, Sarah said carefully, maybe we should all take a moment to... No. Emma's voice cut through the air with surprising force. I'm tired of taking moments to accommodate other people's fears. I'm tired of pretending that my choices should be subject to committee approval. Pete Kowalski shifted in his saddle, his hand moving closer to his gun. Girl, you don't understand what you're doing. This savage has filled your head with lies and threats. We're here to protect you. Protect me from what? From making my own decisions. From choosing a future that doesn't fit your narrow ideas about what my life should look like. Emma stepped closer to the mounted men, her fear transformed into something that looked remarkably like anger. Tell me, Pete, when was the last time any of you asked what I wanted? When did any of you consider that I might have opinions about my own future? Ayana moved slightly, positioning himself where he could see all the armed men while keeping Emma within reach of his protection. Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands remained carefully visible but ready to move if violence erupted. This isn't about what you want, Tom Henderson said, his tone suggesting he was explaining something obvious to a confused child. This is about what's right, about protecting our community from Indian savages who think they can just take whatever they please. He's not taking anything, Emma shot back. I'm giving freely. There's a difference, though apparently it's too subtle for you to understand. Billy Patterson, young and hot-headed, leaned forward in his saddle. Emma, you've been living isolated out here for months. You don't know how to judge character anymore. This Indian has manipulated you into thinking you're making a free choice. Emma's laugh was sharp and bitter. Manipulate? Billy, I've had more honest conversation with Ayana in the past week than I've had with any man in this settlement in the past 2 years. He's the first person who's ever asked me what I think rather than telling me what I should think. Sarah watched the exchange with growing dread, recognizing that the chasm between Emma and their neighbors was too wide to be bridged with words alone. The men had come here expecting to find a frightened girl in need of rescue, and instead they'd found a woman who refused to be saved from her own choices. Emma, Tom Henderson said, his voice taking on a threatening edge. You're coming with us. Tonight, we'll sort this out at my place, where you can think clearly without this savage influencing your judgment. I'm not going anywhere with you. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah could see the moment when Tom Henderson's patience finally snapped, when his paternalistic concern transformed into something darker and more dangerous. The hell you're not. Tom swung down from his horse, his rifle coming with him. Pete, Billy, help me get her away from the Indian. That's when Ayana moved. Not aggressively, but with the fluid precision of someone who understood that violence was about to erupt and intended to be ready for it. He didn't reach for a weapon. Sarah couldn't see any weapons on him except a knife at his belt, but something in his posture made all the mounted men tense, with recognition of a new kind of threat. Touch her without her permission, Ayana said quietly, and learn how Apache warriors respond to men who force themselves on unwilling women. The temperature of the confrontation dropped by several degrees. Pete Kowalski's gun cleared its holster with a metallic whisper that seemed to echo across the prairie. You threatening us, savage? I am explaining consequences. Emma stepped between the two groups, her hands. Sarah could see the assessment in both men's eyes. And I suggest we consider the possibility that our discomfort says more about us than it does about the wisdom of her choice. Emma stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly across the tense gathering. Sheriff Morrison, I want everyone here to understand something. I'm not being forced into this marriage. I'm not confused or manipulated or coerced. I'm making a free choice based on my own judgment. We hear you, Emma, the sheriff replied gently. The question is whether these men are willing to respect that choice. Pete Kowalski's grip on his rifle tightened. Respect? We're supposed to respect a decision that goes against everything decent and Christian. I thought Christianity was supposed to be about love and forgiveness and the radical idea that all people are children of God, Emma said, her voice sharp with irony. But apparently it's actually about armed men deciding which choices women are allowed to make. The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Several of the mounted men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, recognizing the contradiction between their professed faith and their current actions. Sheriff Morrison nodded toward Ayanna. "Son, you've been mighty quiet through all this. You got anything to say about the situation?" Ayanna spoke without taking his eyes off the men with guns. "I have said what I came to say. I asked Emma to be my wife, and she accepted. If these men wish to prevent that marriage through violence, they will learn that Apache warriors do not die easily." The quiet certainty in his voice sent a chill through the gathering. Sarah could see the recognition in the settlers' eyes that they might have misjudged both the man and the situation they were trying to control. But Ayanna continued, "I will not be the cause of bloodshed in this place where Emma has lived. If she chooses to come with me, it will be because she wishes to build something new, not because she is fleeing something destroyed." Tom Henderson looked around at his companions, seeing doubt beginning to creep into faces that had been set with righteous certainty just minutes before. "So what happens now? We just ride away and pretend this is all normal?" "What happens now," Sheriff Morrison said, bending to retrieve his badge from the dust, "is that we act like civilized people instead of a war party. Emma has made her choice. Ayanna has stated his intentions. The rest of us need to decide whether we're going to be part of building a community that respects individual freedom, or whether we're going to be the kind of people who impose our will through threats and violence." He pinned the badge back to his vest with deliberate care. "I know which kind of man I want to be. The question is, what about the rest of you?" The silence stretched across the prairie as each man wrestled with the choice the sheriff had laid before them. Sarah held her breath, watching faces that reflected the internal struggle between fear and decency, between prejudice and the recognition that they might be on the wrong side of history. Pete Kowalski was the first to lower his rifle. "Damn it all to hell," he muttered, but the weapon went back to its holster with reluctant acceptance. One by one, the other men followed suit, their anger cooling into something closer to confused resignation. The immediate threat of violence receded, but Sarah could see that the larger question, whether the community would accept Emma's choice, remained unresolved. The badge on Sheriff Morrison's chest caught the last light of sunset, a symbol of law trying to triumph over the darker impulses of frontier justice. Ayanna's sacred knife emerged from its beaded sheath with a whisper of steel against leather, the blade catching the dying light like captured fire. But instead of raising it as a weapon, he knelt in the dust and placed it carefully on the ground between himself and the group of settlers, the handle pointing toward his own chest in a gesture that spoke of vulnerability rather than threat. "Among my people," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the tense gathering, "when there is dispute that cannot be settled with words, we sometimes offer the sacred blade as proof of our sincerity." Emma stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the knife with a mixture of curiosity and recognition. The blade was exquisite, not a crude tool of war, but a work of art, its steel folded and tempered to create patterns that seemed to flow like water frozen in metal. The handle was wrapped in leather that had been darkened with use and age, and the sheath beside it was decorated with beadwork that told in blue and white and red. "What does it mean?" Sheriff Morrison asked, his hand resting on his own weapon, but his voice respectful of the ritual unfolding before them. "It means," Ayanna replied, "that I offer my life as proof of my word. If any man here believes I have lied about my intentions toward Emma, let him take up this blade and test my honesty with steel." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Sarah felt her heart stop as she realized what her sister's intended husband was proposing: trial by combat, the oldest form of justice, where truth was determined not by evidence or argument, but by the willingness to risk everything on the strength of one's conviction. Tom Henderson stared at the knife, his face pale with the recognition that the situation had moved far beyond anything he'd anticipated. "You're talking about a duel. I am talking about honor," Ayanna corrected. "About the difference between a man who speaks truth and one who speaks lies. If you believe I have deceived Emma, if you believe I have threatened or coerced her, then prove it with your courage rather than your accusations." Pete Kowalski shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "This is insane. We're not living in the Middle Ages." "No," Emma said quietly. "We're living on the frontier, where a person's word is supposed to mean something, where honor is supposed to matter more than convenience." She knelt beside the knife, her movements mirroring Ayanna's with unconscious grace. "But there's something all of you need to understand before anyone picks up this blade." Emma's hand hovered over the steel, not quite touching but close enough that Sarah could see the tremor in her finger. "The debt that started all of this, the obligation Ayanna claimed when he saved Sarah's life, it was never really about me at all." The admission drew everyone's attention like iron to a magnet. Sarah felt the world tilt as she realized that even now, even after everything that had been revealed, there were still truths waiting to emerge from the shadows. "What do you mean?" Sheriff Morrison asked. Emma looked up at Ayanna, seeking confirmation for something she'd understood, but hadn't yet spoken aloud. He nodded slightly, giving her permission to reveal what they'd both recognized, but left unspoken. "The debt was about testing whether Sarah and I were the kind of people worth saving," Emma said. "Whether we had the courage to face difficult choices, the wisdom to see beyond our own fears, the strength to honor our obligations even when they required sacrifice." She stood, brushing dust from her skirts, but keeping her eyes fixed on the knife that lay between them like a bridge between worlds. "Ayanna didn't save Sarah's life because he wanted to claim me as payment. He saved her life because he recognized something in her, something worth preserving. The courtship, the marriage proposal, all of it. It was his way of discovering whether that recognition was justified." Tom Henderson's voice was barely audible. "And was it justified?" Emma smiled for the first time since the confrontation began, an expression that transformed her face from that of a defiant girl into that of a woman who had found her place in the world. "Ask yourself this: how many of the women in your settlement would have the courage to stand here, facing down armed men, defending their right to choose their own future?" The question hung unanswered in the gathering darkness. Sarah looked around at the faces of men she'd known for years and saw them wrestling with a recognition they hadn't expected, that perhaps Emma's choice revealed not her weakness but her strength, not her confusion but her clarity. "The debt," Ayanna said, rising to his feet, but leaving the knife where it lay, "was satisfied the moment Emma chose to educate herself about my people rather than simply reject what she didn't understand. It was satisfied when Sarah chose to trust her sister's judgment rather than impose her own fears. It was satisfied when both women proved they could face the unknown with courage instead of hiding behind the familiar." Sheriff Morrison studied the knife, then looked up at Ayanna with something like respect in his weathered features. "So why the blade? Why offer trial by combat if the debt is already settled?" "Because," Emma answered before Ayanna could speak, "some truths can only be proven by the willingness to risk everything for them. Because courage means being willing to stake your life on your convictions when words alone are not enough." She reached down and lifted the sacred knife, holding it with both hands like an offering. "This blade represents the choice between fear and faith, between the safety of the known and the promise of the unknown. Every person here has to decide whether they're brave enough to let others make that choice for themselves." The steel caught the last light of day, its patterns seeming to dance with possibilities that stretched far beyond the immediate confrontation. Sarah watched her sister hold the sacred blade and realized that Emma had become someone she barely recognized, someone who understood that true freedom required the courage to defend not just your own choices, but others' right to choose differently. The knife lay steady in Emma's hands, waiting for someone to claim it or for everyone to recognize that some battles were won not through violence, but through the simple act of refusing to let fear make decisions that belonged to love. The combined wedding rings lay nested together in Emma's palm, their different metals and styles creating an unexpected harmony. Ayana's grandmother's silver and turquoise ring rested against Sarah's mother's simple gold band, the Apache craftsmanship and frontier simplicity speaking to each other across the divide of cultures that had seemed impossible to bridge just hours before. "They fit together," Emma said softly, turning her hand so the rings caught the light of the lanterns that Sheriff Morrison had lit as darkness settled over the prairie. "I wouldn't have expected that." Sarah watched her sister examine the two rings with the same careful attention she'd given to every important decision of the past week. The immediate crisis had passed. The guns were holstered, the threats withdrawn, the mob dispersed into individual men wrestling with their consciences, but the deeper questions remained unanswered. "Emma," Tom Henderson said, his voice carrying a humility that hadn't been there an hour ago, "I owe you an apology." "We all do." Emma looked up from the rings, her expression thoughtful rather than accusatory. "You were trying to protect me. I understand that. But Tom, there's a difference between protection and control, between caring about someone and trying to own their choices." Iana stood nearby, his sacred knife once again sheathed at his side, after Emma had returned it to him with a ceremony that felt as significant as any wedding ritual. He'd watched the entire confrontation with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting for others to catch up with truths he'd understood from the beginning. "What happens now?" Pete Kowalski asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer and was simply hoping to hear it confirmed with kindness rather than judgment. "Now," Sheriff Morrison said, settling his hat more firmly on his grey head, "we go home and think about what kind of people we want to be. We think about whether we're brave enough to let our neighbors make choices that challenge our assumptions about how life should be lived." Billy Patterson, young and still struggling with the collapse of his certainties, looked directly at Emma. "Are you really going to go through with this? Are you really going to marry him and live among the Apache?" Emma held up the two rings, studying the way their different beauties complemented each other. "Billy, 3 days ago, I thought my future was limited to the choices other people were willing to offer me. Now I'm looking at the possibility of building something entirely new, something that honors both where I come from and where I'm going." She slipped her mother's gold ring onto her right hand and Hayana's grandmother's silver ring onto her left. "Yes, I'm going to marry him. And yes, I'm going to learn what it means to live in a world where women are valued for their strength rather than sheltered because of their supposed weakness." Sarah felt a complex mixture of pride and loss as she watched Emma wearing both rings, symbolically uniting two worlds that had seemed destined for conflict. Her little sister had grown into someone capable of building bridges where others saw only chasms. "What about you, Sarah?" Sheriff Morrison asked gently. "What are your plans now?" Sarah looked around at the faces of her neighbors, men who had known her for years, but who seemed to be seeing her clearly for the first time. "I think I'm going to stay here and see if I can help this community learn to be a place where people like Emma feel free to make their own choices." "And if we can't learn?" Tom Henderson asked. "If some of us are too set in our ways to change, then I suppose I'll have to decide whether I want to be part of a community that values conformity over courage." Sarah's voice carried a new authority, an echo of the strength that Emma had displayed throughout the week. "But I'm hoping it won't come to that. I'm hoping that tonight has shown all of us something about the difference between protecting people and imprisoning them." Ayana stepped forward, his movement drawing everyone's attention. "There is something else that must be said before this ends." He reached into his medicine pouch and withdrew a small object that made Sarah's breath catch, a third ring. This one made of carved bone and decorated with symbols that seemed to tell a story of journey and transformation. "This also belonged to my grandmother," he said, offering it to Sarah. "She wore it before her marriage, when she was a young woman learning to trust her own judgment about the future." Sarah stared at the bone ring, understanding the significance of the offer, even as she struggled to process it. "I don't understand. My grandmother believed that courage was contagious." Ayana explained that when one person found the strength to choose their own path, it made it easier for others to find their own strength. She said that the debt of inspiration could only be repaid by inspiring others. Emma moved to stand beside Sarah, the two rings on her hands catching the lantern light. "He's offering you the chance to choose your own future, just as I chose mine. The question is, what kind of future do you want?" Sarah looked at the bone ring, then at the faces of the people around her. Her sister, who had found the courage to leap into the unknown, the Apache warrior who had taught them all something about the nature of honor, the neighbors who were struggling to expand their understanding of what was possible. "I want a future where choices like Emma's are celebrated rather than feared," Sarah said slowly. "Where courage is valued more than conformity, where the unknown is seen as an opportunity rather than a threat." She took the bone ring from Ayana's outstretched hand, feeling its smooth weight against her palm. "I want to help build a community worthy of the people who are brave enough to choose love over fear." As she slipped the ring onto her finger, Sarah felt something shift inside her. Not just acceptance of Emma's choice, but recognition of her own power to shape the world around her. The three rings, gold, silver, and bone, represented three different kinds of courage, three different ways of facing the future with hope instead of fear. The prairie wind stirred the lantern flames, casting dancing shadows across the faces of people who had learned something important about themselves and each other. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose between the familiar and the possible. But tonight had proven that even the most entrenched divisions could be bridged by those brave enough to try. Emma and Ayana stood together, their hands intertwined, while Sarah wore the ring that marked her as someone willing to help others find their own paths to freedom. The settlement would never be quite the same, but perhaps that was exactly what it needed. The disruption that comes when courage challenges convention and wins. The shared garden stretched between what had once been two separate worlds, its neat rows of vegetables and herbs, representing 6 months of careful cultivation and even more careful diplomacy. Sarah knelt among the bean plants, her hands dark with soil as she worked alongside Maria Santos, the young Mexican woman who had married Billy Patterson in a ceremony that had raised almost as many eyebrows as Emma's wedding to Ayana. "The tomatoes are coming in beautifully this year," Maria said, her English still carrying the musical accent of her childhood, but growing stronger with each passing month. Emma's suggestion about the companion planting really worked. Sarah smiled as she watched Maria tend to the plants with the same careful attention that Emma had always brought to growing things. The garden had been Emma's idea, a place where the women of the settlement could work together, sharing knowledge and building relationships that transcended the cultural boundaries their husbands sometimes struggled to cross. "She learned that from our mother," Sarah replied, sitting back on her heels to survey their progress. "Mother always said that gardens taught you more about life than any book ever could." On the far side of the garden, Martha Kelly was showing young Rebecca Henderson how to identify the medicinal herbs that Ayana's sister had introduced to their community. The Apache woman, whose name was Itzel, had arrived 3 months ago with her own husband and children, part of a gradual migration that was transforming the settlement in ways no one could have predicted. "Sarah," Maria said quietly, "I wanted to thank you for what you said at the town meeting last week." Sarah looked up from the bean plants, remembering the heated discussion about whether to establish formal trade relationships with the Apache bands in the region. "I just spoke the truth. This community is stronger when we embrace difference instead of fearing it." Still, it mattered, especially coming from you. Maria's smile was grateful, but tinged with understanding of how difficult the past months had been. "People listen to you in a way they don't listen to the rest of us." Sarah nodded, recognizing the responsibility that came with being accepted as a bridge between the settlement's old guard and its evolving future. Her role had changed dramatically since Emma's wedding, shifting from protective older sister to something more like a community elder, despite being only 27 years old. The sound of children's laughter drifted across the garden from the small schoolhouse that had been built near the creek. Emma's voice could be heard among them, clear and patient as she taught the mixed group of Apache, Mexican and Anglo children to read from the primers that Sheriff Morrison had ordered from back east. "How is she?" Maria asked, following Sarah's gaze toward the schoolhouse. "Emma, I mean, is she happy?" Sarah considered the question with the care it deserved. Emma's transformation over the past 6 months had been remarkable to witness. Not the loss of identity that many had feared, but rather the blossoming of aspects of her personality that had been constrained by the narrow expectations of frontier life. "She's different," Sarah said finally. "Stronger, more confident. She speaks Apache almost fluently now, and she's learned more about healing herbs and child-rearing practices than I ever knew existed. But yes, I think she's happy. Genuinely happy in a way I'd never seen before." Through the window of the schoolhouse, Sarah could see Emma demonstrating something to a group of children clustered around her, her hands moving in the fluid gestures that had become second nature since her marriage. She wore a dress that combined Anglo and Apache elements, practical cotton fabric cut in a traditional style but decorated with beadwork that told stories in colors and patterns. "And Ayana?" Maria asked. "How has he adapted to living so close to the settlement?" Sarah smiled at that question. Ayana's adjustment had been perhaps the most surprising aspect of the entire arrangement. Rather than the remote, threatening figure the settlers had imagined, he'd proven to be thoughtful, patient, and remarkably skilled at navigating the complex politics of cultural integration. "Better than any of us expected," Sarah replied. "He's been teaching some of the men about tracking and hunting techniques, and his knowledge of water sources helped us improve our irrigation system. Tom Henderson actually sought his advice about crop rotation last month." The irony wasn't lost on either woman. Tom Henderson, who had been ready to shoot Ayana 6 months ago, now regularly consulted him about agricultural matters, and had even invited him to join the settlement's informal council of advisors. "What about you?" Maria asked gently. "Are you happy with how things have turned out?" Sarah looked around the garden, taking in the visual evidence of successful cooperation. Corn planted according to Apache techniques, growing beside vegetables that Maria had introduced from her family's farming traditions, all tended by women who had learned to see their differences as resources rather than obstacles. "I'm proud," she said slowly, "proud of Emma for having the courage to choose her own path, proud of our community for proving that people can change when they're challenged to be better than they thought they could be. Proud of myself for learning that protection isn't about preventing people from taking risks, it's about creating environments where they can take risks safely." She stood and brushed the soil from her hands, noting how the work had polished her palms in new patterns, marking her as someone who had learned to build rather than simply maintain. "But mostly," Sarah continued, "I'm curious about what comes next. 6 months ago, I thought I knew what my life would look like for the next 20 years. Now I wake up each morning wondering what new possibility might appear, what new challenge might teach me something I didn't know I needed to learn." The bone ring that Ayana had given her caught the afternoon sunlight, its carved symbol seeming to shift and change as she moved her hand. She'd worn it every day since that confrontational evening, a reminder that courage was something that had to be practiced daily rather than summoned only in moments of crisis. "Speaking of what comes next," Maria said with a smile that suggested she was harboring important news, "I should probably tell you that Billy and I are expecting our first child in the spring." Sarah felt a warm surge of happiness for the young couple, followed immediately by excitement about what this meant for their evolving community. "That's wonderful news, Maria. Does Emma know?" "She was the first person I told. She's already talking about setting up a proper midwifery training program, combining what she's learned from the Apache women with what Martha Kelly knows from her years of experience." Sarah laughed, recognizing Emma's instinct to turn personal joy into community benefit. "That sounds exactly like something she would do. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the shared garden, Sarah felt a deep satisfaction in the knowledge that the seeds planted by Emma's brave choice were continuing to grow in directions none of them had anticipated. The settlement was becoming something new, not fully Anglo, not fully Apache, not fully Mexican, but rather a hybrid community that drew strength from its willingness to adapt and evolve. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose between fear and hope, but today had provided clear evidence that when people committed to building bridges rather than walls, remarkable things became possible. The children's cradle sat in the corner of Emma's cabin, its carved surfaces telling stories that would bridge generations. Ayana had spent months crafting it from oak that grew near the creek, working the symbols of both cultures into the wood with patient artistry. Eagles soared alongside Christian crosses, Apache spirals intertwined with frontier roses, creating a visual narrative of two worlds learning to become one. Sarah traced her finger along the smooth edge of the cradle, marveling at the skill required to carve such intricate details. "It's beautiful, Ayana. This baby will grow up surrounded by the best of both our traditions." Emma moved carefully around the small cabin, her pregnancy now advanced enough that simple tasks required deliberate planning. At 7 months, she carried herself with the confident grace of a woman who had found her place in the world and was preparing to welcome new life into it. "The baby's been active today," Emma said, settling into the rocking chair that Tom Henderson had built as an apology gift months earlier. "I think he or she approves of the cradle." Ayana looked up from where he was applying the final coat of protective oil to the wood, his expression soft with anticipation and pride. "My grandmother always said that children choose their parents as much as parents choose each other. This one has picked wisely." Sarah watched the interaction between her sister and brother-in-law with continued amazement at how naturally their partnership had developed. What had begun as an arranged marriage born from cultural obligation had evolved into something that looked remarkably like genuine love and mutual respect. "What will you name the baby?" Sarah asked, settling into the second chair that Ayana had crafted for visitors. "That depends," Emma replied, her hand resting on her rounded belly. "Apache children receive their names based on the circumstances of their birth, the signs that appear when they enter the world, but we're also thinking about names that would honor both sides of the family." Ayana set down his work and moved to stand beside Emma's chair, his hand covering hers on her stomach. "If it's a boy, we thought perhaps Jonathan, for your father, with an Apache name that he would earn through his actions as he grows. And if it's a girl?" Sarah asked. Emma's smile was radiant with possibility. "Mary, for our mother, but also something that speaks to her future rather than just her past. A name that suggests someone capable of building bridges between worlds." Sarah felt a surge of emotion at the thought of her parents' names living on in this new generation. This child, who would grow up taking for granted the kind of cultural integration that had seemed impossible just a year ago. "Have you thought about what kind of world you want to raise this child in?" Sarah asked. "Every day," Emma replied. "I want them to grow up in a place where difference is celebrated rather than feared, where courage is valued more than conformity, where love is understood to be stronger than the barriers people try to build between communities." Ayana nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Among my people, we believe that children are gifts from the Creator, sent to teach us things we didn't know we needed to learn. This child will grow up understanding both Apache and Anglo ways, carrying the best of each tradition into a future we can't yet imagine." Through the window, Sarah could see the settlement that had become home to all of them. Houses built in various styles reflecting the diverse backgrounds of their residents, gardens that combine traditional and indigenous growing techniques, children playing games that drew from multiple cultural traditions. "What about you, Sarah?" Emma asked gently. "Have you given any more thought to what you want your own future to look like?" Sarah touched the bone ring that had become her talisman, feeling the smooth surface that Ayana's grandmother had worn as a young woman, learning to trust her own judgment. I've been thinking about opening a school, a real school, not just the informal lessons we've been providing. Somewhere children from all our communities could learn together, where they could grow up seeing diversity as normal, rather than exceptional. That's a wonderful idea, Ayana said. Education is the most powerful tool for building understanding between peoples. Emma leaned forward in her rocking chair, her eyes bright with interest. What would you need to make that happen? Support from the community, which I think we have now. Curriculum that honors multiple traditions without favoring one over others. Teachers who understand that learning is about opening minds, rather than filling them with predetermined ideas. Sarah paused, considering the magnitude of what she was proposing.